Hi everybody, welcome to the webinar. It is Monday, May 9th, 2016, and tonight's webinar is a review of the book, The Four Agreements. This is one of those books that we give to our students and clients, but I think it's one of those books that also has as much application to us as parents as it does to them. And I think a lot of parents talk about sharing this book with their children as they go through this process. So reading it and going through it. Tonight's webinar is going to be text heavy. If you want copies of the slides, you can go to the parent portal and download them there, or you can request them at webinar@drbradreedy.com. So there's going to be a lot of great quotes. It's kind of like the cliff notes to the Four Agreements tonight, and then I'll make comments as we go. I'll start with some precursors to the Four Agreements, some preambles to the Four Agreement. And Miguel Ruiz talks about the Toltec, and about how the Toltec are a group of people, not necessarily a race, but a group of people who are committed to a certain spiritual philosophy. Thousands of years ago, the Toltec were known throughout southern Mexico as women and men of knowledge. Anthropologists have spoken of the Toltec as a nation or race, but in fact, the Toltec were scientists and artists who formed a society to explore and conserve the spiritual knowledges and practices of the ancient ones. They came together as masters and students at the ancient city of pyramids outside Mexico City, known as the place where man becomes God. And while this is an ancient philosophical and spiritual text that Miguel Ruiz is drawing upon, I think there's a tremendous amount that's applicable in the psychology of today, what we know of today. So it can be seen as a metaphor, it can be seen as a spiritual practice, and it also can be seen as a psychological awareness. He talks about this idea that we didn't have the opportunity as children to choose our beliefs, right? That they were imposed on us, and that we were rewarded for them, rewarded mainly with attention, right? Something that a child craves and seeks to feel meaningful, to feel alive. And so those agreements couldn't be said as children that's something that we consciously adhere to, but it's something that that gets reinforced and kind of imprinted on our soul. He calls these belief systems that we get presented and imprinted with, he calls them agreements. With a fear of being punished and a fear of not getting a reward, we start pretending to be what we are not, just to please others, just to be good enough for someone else. This is a lot like we talk about in Alice Miller's book, The Drama of the Gifted Child, where she talks about the development of the false self. So in psychoanalytic theory, it could be considered developing the false self in order to earn the love and attention of our parents or of our caregivers. Very, very similar concept. And we start to pretend to repress those parts of ourselves that aren't going to get us attention, and to pretend to be or to show up in a way that we think is going to reinforce that or gain us that acceptance from others. We need a great deal of courage to challenge our own beliefs, because even if we didn't choose all of our beliefs, it is true that we agreed to all of them. This agreement is so strong that even if we understand the concept of it not being true, we feel the blame, the guilt, and the shame that occur if we go against these rules. This is so powerful because in therapy, we talk about these insights, these aha moments. And we can identify many of those. I think for a lot of us, that's the first step, is being able to identify new insight, new ways of thinking, new ways of being in relationships. However, it doesn't necessarily go away there. And all of us who have been to therapy know that. We have to fight against the blame, the guilt, and the shame that occur when we go against these rules. Like I talk about all the time, when I ask parents who say to me, I knew I was doing the wrong thing, or I knew in this situation I was doing the wrong thing, and then I say, why did you do it then? And they'll almost always tell me because of guilt, sometimes because of fear. But when we get down to it, it's also that fear of being rejected, that fear of not being loved. So it's valuable to know that the work of therapy is often the stuff that goes on between the sessions, between the books that you read, between the meetings that you attend, between the webinars that you watch. We can get clarity as we go through therapy, but we have to develop a capacity or a courage to be able to challenge and walk through those barriers of guilt and blame and shame. 95% of the beliefs that we have stored in our minds are nothing but lies, and we suffer because we believe these lies. So this is bold language, right? This is a bold way of inviting us to challenge the beliefs of the culture that we grew up in. This is terrifying, right? This is hard work. And this is the thing that parents are willing to do in the context of a child who's struggling at the level that your kids are struggling, right? They're willing to start to challenge their beliefs. And the most frightening thing that happens when we start to challenge our beliefs is that when we challenge one of them, or one of them gets challenged, or we remove one of them, that everything else becomes up for grabs. And there's no solid ground for us to step on, right? We don't know where to go. We don't know what the rules are. Where are the barriers, the guardrails for us anymore? Because we've started to consider the possibility that many, if not all, the things that we were taught were possibly untrue or were incorrect by some degree. He says it this way: to be alive is the greatest fear humans have. Death is not the biggest fear we have. Our biggest fear is taking the risk to be alive. The risk to be alive and express what we really are. Because we have been absolutely punished into denying who we really are. Right? That's the analytic idea, and also the idea that comes from the Four Agreements. We've been told not to think, not to feel, not to imagine what we think, feel, and imagine. Because to do so frightened others, right? It frightened others that we might go crazy or do some unthinkable act or just be unhappy. So we were asked to repress that for the comfort of another. And then when we decide to start to take the risk to consider being and showing up in the world in a different way, in spite of all these ghosts, these messages, these agreements, as Ruiz calls them, we face our greatest fear. We dishonor ourselves just to please other people. We even do harm to our physical bodies just to be accepted by others. You see teenagers taking drugs just to avoid being rejected by other teenagers. They're not aware that the problem is that they don't accept themselves. They reject themselves because they are not what they pretend to be. They wish to be a certain way, but they are not, and for this they carry shame and guilt. Humans punish themselves endlessly for not being what they believe they should be. They become very self-abusive, and they use other people to abuse themselves. So that's that idea that we introduced to you in the instructions to the impact letter, right? We ask you in our communication model to stop using the word should, or have to, or must, or ought to, or need to, or got to. Even right and wrong and good and bad are words that we ask you to remove from your vocabulary because of this process that he's describing. That we have dictated to us, this is the way that men are supposed to act, or women are supposed to act, or children, or adults, or black people, or white people. And all of a sudden we have all these rules imposed upon us, and we lose touch with our authentic selves. And then something like this experience with your child cracks that shell, that casing, and we consider the possibility that we might rebel against these rules and these agreements. In your whole life, nobody has ever abused you more than you have abused yourself. And the limit of your self-abuse is exactly the limit that you will tolerate from someone else. If someone else abuses you a little more than you abuse yourself, you will probably walk away from that person. But if someone abuses you a little less than you abuse yourself, you will probably stay in the relationship and tolerate it endlessly. I think a major idea in this book or concept or invitation is personal accountability. It's going to challenge for many of us our own ideas about being a victim, right? While we are born into this world in many ways without the capability to choose our belief system, Don Miguel asks us to have the courage to be responsible for them and to walk out of the victim stance. And so a lot of times we talk about the people in our lives that abuse us. And we give examples where we can't walk away from that relationship. When really we're saying the consequences, the things we have to face are too painful or too frightening. And so this book really is an awakening to accountability, to personal responsibility, an invitation to take back your own life. And this idea about allowing people in our lives, that the people we surround ourselves with, even inevitably, are similar to the people, similar to the way that we judge and treat ourselves. I'm not talking about the random stranger that walks up to you that does something harmful. We're talking about the people that end up in your life in relationship. Your whole mind is a fog, which the Toltecs called a mitote. Your mind is a dream where 1,000 people talk at the same time and nobody understands each other. In object relations theory, a theory in psychology, this idea that we have all of these objects, all of these ideas in our head from other people. A lot of times I'll say to somebody in therapy, I'll say, that doesn't sound like it. You were born with that. That sounds like somebody else's belief. I was just talking to a family recently this weekend where the child said, I did this thing and it was stupid. And then the next sentence out of his mouth was, it wasn't really stupid, but my mom thought it was stupid. So I stopped him and I said, so let's practice that again. Let's practice you starting off with saying, my mom thinks it was stupid, but I didn't think it was stupid. And I know it's a small thing, but it begins to take on a significant meaning in our lives when we can separate out what other voices are and with what ours are. I talk to parents all the time about the noise that society and others and their children and their co-parent provide in their head, all that noise in their head, and how can they learn to quiet that noise and find their authentic, honest, courageous voice. And that takes work. That takes work. Because we were told in our growing up years to honor those other voices, that those other voices were the truth. And then we replicate this pattern with our children, where we impose upon them our truth. I say to parents all the time, you don't know your child's truth. You barely know your own. And that's a lifelong battle to listen to it, to find it, and to hold on to it. But you don't know your child's truth. And that's part of what they're rebelling against, is the imposing of our truth onto them. That doesn't mean, again, like I always say, that you're passive, that you're not assertive. You show up honestly and authentically. You set your boundaries. You make your decisions as a parent in your home and in relationship to your child. But you don't know their truth. So let's talk about the 4 agreements specifically. The first agreement is be impeccable with your word. Now let us see what the word impeccability means. Impeccability means without sin. Impeccable comes from the Latin, probably going to pronounce the Latin wrong, peccatus, which means sin. The im in impeccable means without. So impeccable means without sin. A sin is anything that you do which goes against yourself. Everything you feel or believe or say that goes against yourself is a sin. You go against yourself when you judge or blame yourself for anything. Being without sin is exactly the opposite. Being impeccable is not going against yourself. And then I've added italics here. When you are impeccable, you take responsibility for your actions, but you do not judge or blame yourself. I cannot underscore enough how important I think that last sentence is. So much of my parent education, or for that matter, my therapy with the clients and students in the field is, can you look at yourself and be accountable without the unnecessarily energy of guilt and blame and shame? Can you do that? Can you show up as a parent on a parent phone call, in a family session, at a dinner with your child, in a letter? Can you show up, take the risk, be coached, be accountable for what you say and how you say it without it being poisoned by or contaminated by blame and shame? If you can learn and you can grow. If you judge yourself, right? If you are non-compassionate with yourself, you're going to defend against or be defensive about how you show up. So the idea is to show up in a way that's authentic, in a way that is true to yourself, and without shame, without judgment. And that's a very big challenge. Most of the parents that I deal with have a hard time doing that, have a hard time looking at themselves, being accountable without it being laced with blame and shame. If I love myself, I will express that love in my interactions with you. And then I am being impeccable with the word. because that action will produce a like reaction. If I love you, then you will love me. If I insult you, then you will insult me. If I have gratitude for you, you'll have gratitude for me. I can imagine many of you on the other side of the screen right now saying that's not true at all. I can give examples of it. But this is what Don Miguel is proposing, is suggesting this idea that if we can learn to show up authentically, learn to show up with pure love, with impeccable love, then we'll receive that back. Being impeccable with your word is the correct use of energy. It means to use your energy in the direction of truth and love for yourself. And again, it doesn't mean that everybody that you love will love you back, but what it means is you'll surround yourself with people because of that expression who can love you back. And you will end up dismissing or walking away from those people who can't. An illustration of this piece. This goes back to some of my teachings around the book The Misery of the Good Child by J.D. Gill. There's a story that he uses to illustrate this of a mother who had a migraine headache and a little girl, and she said to her daughter, "Shut up. You have an ugly voice. Can you just shut up?" The truth is that the mother's tolerance for any noise was non-existent. It was not that the little girl's voice was ugly, but the daughter believed what her mother said. And in that moment, she made an agreement with herself. After that, she no longer sang, because she believed her voice was ugly and would bother anyone who heard it. She became shy at school, and even if she was asked to sing, she refused. Even speaking to others became difficult for her. Everything changed in the little girl because of this new agreement. She believed she must repress her emotions in order to be accepted and loved. If we can think of this singing as a metaphor, right, as a metaphor for showing up in a way that our parents find terrifying or anxiety producing or repulsive or disgusting, and we believe it when our parents tell us that, instead of knowing and hearing, instead of our parent taking responsibility and saying, I can't deal with it, it's too much for me, it's outside of what I'm comfortable with, right? All of those things thus being about the parent, and learning to talk that way to our children, right? We can look at it from both sides. But instead, normally we tell our children, or our parents tell us, stop it, it's disgusting, it's wrong, it's bad, don't do it. And then we begin to shut down. We begin to repress. We begin to not speak our authentic self because we've been told that our authentic self is terrifying. And then we develop symptoms. Symptoms are that energy, that core self leaking out in kind of maladaptive mutilations, mutilated ways, if you will. You can measure the impeccability of your word by the level of self-love. How much you love yourself and how you feel about yourself are directly proportionate to the quality and integrity of your word. When you are impeccable with your word, you feel good, you feel happy and at peace. So again, there's a ton of self-compassion in this first agreement, right? We develop this self-compassion and we reduce suffering. We develop self-compassion and we quiet the judge's voice, is what Ruiz says. Right? We learn, we grow, we're open, we're teachable. We learn and practice to show up authentically. We learn to not be held hostage by fear or anxiety. We learn to take one step farther each time. And in his words, we become alive, which is our greatest fear, he says. All right, the second agreement, don't take anything personally. This one's probably more mainstream today than anything, but he takes it to a really incredible high place. Personal importance, or taking things personally, is the maximum expression of selfishness because we make the assumption that everything is about me. So, when your child says, I hate you, you're a jerk, when your partner says, you're a jerk, and you take it personally, you take it as anything other than, wow, I can see you're in pain. Wow, I can see you're hurt. And we respond to it as if that's what they said. When we see it as anything other than something about them, we take it personally. Now, most people would deny that because what they end up doing is they end up arguing with the other person. I'm not what you say that I am. Let me explain to you how I did it right. right? That's typically what we say. And then we defend it when a therapist or somebody points out that we're taking it personally. And we say, no, I'm not. But we are. And so when you do anything other than listen and reflect and empathize, you're taking it personally because it touches on a wound that you have inside of yourself. Nothing other people do is because of you. It is because of themselves. All people live in their own dream, in their own mind. They are in a completely different world from the one that we live in. When we take something personally, we make the assumption that they know what is in our world, and we try to impose our world on their world. Even when a situation seems so personal, even if others insult you directly, it has nothing to do with you. What they say, what they do, and the opinions they give are according to the agreements they have in their own mind. It is not important to me what you think about me, and I don't take what you think personally. I don't take it personally when people say, Miguel, you are the best. And I also don't take it personally when they say, Miguel, you are the worst. I mean, I think that's a great example in that last bullet point, right? When somebody tells you how great you are, it's not about you. It's about the part in you that they see of themselves, or the part of themselves that they see in you. And so I try to practice when somebody says, you're wonderful, or that was great, or I try to say, I say thank you, but I say, that's really about you. That means that you see something in me that you know, that you admire, that's in you. Or else you couldn't see it, right? You couldn't admire it. So it's not about me when you compliment me, or when you say that I'm great, or vice versa, or the reverse. You may even tell me, Miguel, what you are saying is hurting me. But it is not what I am saying that is hurting you. It is that you have wounds that I touch by what I have said. You are hurting yourself. Again, these are pretty high ideals, right? The capacity for somebody else to hurt us is found in our woundedness. Because if you can imagine, just use it for this idea. Imagine somebody who had a totally healed and completed and heaven-like sense of self. And somebody else said something harmful or hurtful to them that wouldn't injure them. They would see the limitation in that person. They would see the hurt in that person. And they would respond compassionately and patiently. But we're not like that. So we hurt because they touch our wounds. As you make a habit of not taking anything personally, you won't need to place your trust in what others say. You will only need to trust yourself to make responsible choices. You are never responsible for the actions of others. You are only responsible for you. When you truly understand this and refuse to take things personally, you can hardly be hurt by the careless comments or actions of others. In Al-Anon, what they say is, what you think about me is none of my business. And in a way, that's true with your children, too. I ask you to listen to your children, but not to listen to them to find out about you. Let me say that again. I ask you, I implore you, I teach you, I talk about it with you, to listen to your children, but not to listen to your children to find out about you. I ask you to listen to your children to find out about them. And most of the time, we make that mistake. We think that the feedback is about us. There may be something in that for us to consider or to learn from, but it's not necessarily about us at all. Never is. If those statements stick and they hurt us and they wound us, then it touches upon our wound. If they resonate with us and we are inspired by them and we learn from them, then we grow from them, then it's something that we can look at, something we can learn from. But that's not why we listen. And if we're just listening to other people to learn about ourselves, we're missing them altogether. And that's what most of us do. Unfortunately, we do it with our children. You can ask for what you need. You can say yes or you can say no, whatever you choose, without guilt or self-judgment. You can choose to follow your heart always. Then you can be in the middle of hell and still experience inner peace and happiness. You can stay in your state of bliss, and hell will not affect you at all. I think this is important for parents who are suffering as children suffer, right? This is another way that I talk about making your peace and your serenity your responsibility. But oftentimes parents will tell their children over and over and over again how much they're suffering, how much the child is causing their suffering, in an attempt to try to get the child to change. And what Don Miguel is saying is that your peace, your serenity is your responsibility. Right? Someone else doesn't make you lose that. You give it away. So part of what he asks us to do is be responsible for our own serenity, our own peace, our own happiness, even as parents. This is not applicable to the random person, but even as parents. All right, the third agreement, don't make assumptions. Probably another pretty typical one. We create a lot of emotional poison by by making assumptions and taking it personally, because we usually start gossiping about our assumption. Because we are afraid to ask for clarification, we make assumptions and believe we are right about those assumptions, the assumptions. Then we defend our assumptions and try to make someone else wrong. It is always better to ask questions than to make an assumption, because assumptions set us up for suffering. This is so powerful, right? For both sides of it, because in communication theory we call it mind reading, right? We think we know. We don't ask questions. Tell me more about that. Tell me where you got that idea. I remember back when my therapist would say to me early in my work with her, I would say something that I thought she knew absolutely to be true, and she would ask me follow-up questions, and then I would have to explain my assumptions. I'd have to explain my beliefs with her. She never took it for granted. When I thought, gosh, she's really smart, she's been doing this for a long time, 40, 50 years, seems like she should know. This idea about making somebody else wrong, I think this is key. This is like the chapter in my book on the myth of being right. I talk about this with families all the time. When we make it about right and wrong, when we need to make somebody else wrong in our relationship, when we need to be right, we have to make somebody else wrong. So assumptions are a big challenge in relationship. These assumptions are made so fast and unconsciously most of the time because we have agreements to communicate this way. We have agreed that it is not safe to ask questions. We have agreed that if people love us, they should know what we want or what we feel or how we feel. When we believe something, we assume we are right about it to the point that we will destroy relationships in order to defend our position. How many of us codependents think that people should just want, just believe, just want to and do what we think, what we assume? We don't want to ask for it. We don't want to request it, right? And then we sit back and blame and be the victim instead of learning to say, this is what I like, this is what I believe, this is what I need, here's my request. We don't want to do that. And if they loved us, if they really loved us, they would know ahead of time. We do that so often in our relationships because we don't want to ask questions, because we're afraid. We make assumptions that everyone else sees life the way we do. We assume that others think the way we think, feel the way we feel, judge the way we judge, and abuse the way we abuse. This is the biggest assumption that humans make. And this is why we have a fear of being ourselves around others, because we think everyone else will judge us, victimize us, abuse us, and blame us as we do ourselves. So even before others have a chance to reject us, we've already rejected ourselves. This is the way of the human mind works. Like I said, I started talking about this. I remember, this is 15, 16 years ago, I was talking with my therapist about what love was in relationships, and I said, you know, people will love you if you take care of their needs and deny your own. And I remember she had this incredulous look on her face, this perplexed look on her face, and she said, really? And I thought, she's just playing a game. I really did. I assumed everybody thought that and everybody knew that. And she presented something to me which at the time I dismissed for the most part. She said, I think it's possible for you to take care of your own needs, in other words, to be who you are and not give that up for somebody else and for them still to love you. And I remember thinking, she's crazy, this is some kind of stupid technique, and it doesn't exist. And of course, since that time, through a lot of work in myself and in my marriage, I've come to understand that I really can show up in my marriage and in relationships and be loved for who I am. So it's an example of something I assumed everybody believed. She asked some questions. She challenged it. She suggested the possibility of something else. And I learned it to be true. Often when you go into a relationship with someone you like, you have to justify why you like that person. You only see what you want to see and you deny the things that you don't like about that person. You lie to yourself just to make yourself right. Then you make assumptions. And one of the assumptions is, my love will change this person. But this is not true. Your love will not change anybody. If others change, it's because they want to change, not because you can change them. This is romantic love. This is, and when we get into trouble in marriage, when we start to see the things that we don't like, right? Because our love hasn't fixed them, hasn't changed them. Then we start having to be honest with ourselves. And we start having to take accountability for how we showed up together, why we fit early on. And the reason we fit early on is because of this dynamic that Don Miguel was talking about. Right? We deny the things that we don't like. We're not honest with ourselves in the process. We go through this delusional place of romantic love. And then we get to know the other person and get to know ourselves. And we're around them enough, and then we have to go through this process. And we can. We can go through it. This doesn't mean that you can never get divorced or break off a relationship. It doesn't mean that at all. Just the opposite. It does mean that you become more honest with yourself and take responsibility for how you get into relationships. And not blame the other person for some kind of betrayal. Simply, merely. The way to keep yourself from making assumptions is to ask questions. Make sure the communication is clear. If you don't understand, ask. Also, find your voice to ask for what you want. Everyone has the right to tell you no or yes, but you always have the right to ask. Likewise, everybody has the right to ask you, and you have the right to say no. That's pretty simple stuff, right? So many people I work with struggle with this, though. Like, they don't want to ask, and they have a hard time saying no. They don't want to get rejected. They go more into a coercive, manipulative, try to convince the other person to do what they want. They don't make requests, but they make demands and threats and ultimatums. And I'm not talking about ultimatums in a relationship where if you keep drinking, I'm not going to be in the relationship. Not ultimatums like that. I'm talking about small, everyday ultimatums. Right? Not requests in the process. And again, struggling with saying no. Struggling with saying, no, I can't talk about that with you right now. Just this last week, there was a moment where I was busy doing something, really had a lot going for work. I was going on a trip, and my wife said, I need to talk to you about something. It wasn't problem solving, but she said, I need to talk to you about it. Do you have the time and energy to talk to me about it? And I said no. And it was the hardest thing in the world for me to do. I'm not accustomed to saying no. It's difficult. I want to be there. I want to be the one who can be there for her. And she was completely respectful of it. She said, I understand. I'm glad you could be honest with me and tell me no. And I said, in essence, I said, I'm sorry, you're going to have to talk to somebody else about what you're feeling right now, what's going on. It wasn't about me. It was about something that was going on in her life. And I apologize that I can't be the one. And I was afraid of being a bad husband and of abandoning her. And I was afraid that she was going to think that I didn't care. Right? All of those things. And that's the challenge around showing up in a relationship. And that's hard work. Don't make assumptions. Just saying this sounds easy, but I understand that it is difficult to do. It is difficult because we so often do exactly the opposite. We have all these habits and routines that we are not even aware of. Becoming aware of these habits and understanding the importance of this agreement is the first step. But understanding its importance is not enough. Information or an idea is merely the seed in your mind. What will really make the difference is action. Taking the action over and over again strengthens your will, nurtures the seed, and establishes a solid foundation for the new habit to grow. After many repetitions, these new agreements will become second nature, and you will see how the magic of your word transforms you. I remember 6 years ago where I had an acute awareness during a certain phase in my life of a challenge that I was experiencing. And I remember where I was in my car leaving my therapy session where I understood, gosh, I was just so clear this last hour. And now as I drive closer to home, I'm losing it. I'm losing that clarity, and fear is overcoming me. And I came to the awareness, I thought, therapy isn't the end. Therapy is the beginning. The hard work comes in between the sessions. The hard work comes when I know what I need to do for myself, but I'm terrified to do it, and I do it anyway. Right? That's the process. And that's what he's describing here in terms of insight versus action. The fourth agreement, always do your best. Now this is going to sound sounds a little bit strange given what he talks about. Under any circumstance, always do your best. No more and no less, but keep in mind that your best is never going to be the same from one moment to the next. Everything is alive and changing all the time, so your best will sometimes be high quality and other times will be not as good. It really is a way of talking about self-compassion. Really is. Because sometimes your best isn't that great. Sometimes your best kind of stinks. And sometimes your best is amazing. So it's more about being compassionate with yourself and recognizing that you're doing the best you can at any given moment in a lot of ways. Just do your best in any circumstance in your life. It doesn't matter if you're sick or tired, or if you always do your best, there's no way you can judge yourself. And then this is not from the book directly, but it's the dialectical that I talk about in my book, where we embrace this idea of you are doing the best you can and you can always do better. Right? It's that idea. Can you embrace and hold both of those ideas at the same time? Okay, here's a story. There's a man who wanted to transcend his suffering, so he went to a Buddhist temple to find a master to help him. Master, if I meditate 4 hours a day, how long will it take me to transcend? The master looked at him and said, if you meditate 4 hours a day, perhaps you will transcend in 10 years. Thinking he could do better, the man then said, oh master, what if I meditated 8 hours a day? How long will it take me to transcend? The master looked at him and said, if you meditate 8 hours a day, perhaps you will transcend in 20 years. But why will it take me longer if I meditate more? The man asked. The master replied, you are not here to sacrifice your joy or your life. You are here to live, to be happy, and to love. If you can do your best in 2 hours of meditation, but you spend 8 hours instead, you will only grow tired, miss the point, and you won't enjoy your life. Do your best, and perhaps you will learn that no matter how long you meditate, you can live, love, and be happy. And so, in a way, this is about being too attached. Right? Even being attached to being detached is the problem. That you don't have to wait to be happy. That you can be happy now. That you can let go of suffering and fear and anxiety now. Right? It's that idea that nothing is causing your suffering except for your choice to suffer. And your choice to suffer is found in the agreements that you accept without question about life, about the way things should be or ought to be. When you do your best and learn to accept yourself, but you have to be aware and learn from your mistakes. Learning from your mistakes means you practice. Look honestly at the results and keep practicing. This increases your awareness. This is so often what I see parents struggle with. Right? They want to get it right. They want to do it perfect. They talk about getting in trouble or screwing it up a lot of the time. And this first bullet point is the opposite sentiment, the opposite approach of that kind of thinking. You make your mistakes, learn from them, practice, look at them, keep practicing. The first three agreements will only work if you do your best. And don't expect that you will always be able to be impeccable with your word. Your routine habits are too strong and firmly rooted in your mind, but you can do your best. Don't expect that you will never take anything personally. Just do your best. Don't expect that you will never make another assumption, but you can certainly do your best. It's about not comparing yourself to anybody. It's about no standard of absolute or right or perfection. It's about thinking about yourself and the way you are in the world differently. By doing your best, the habits of misusing your word, taking things personally, and making assumptions, you'll become weaker and less. They'll become weaker and less frequent with time. And then I added the italics. You don't need to judge yourself, feel guilty, or punish yourself if you cannot keep these agreements. If you're doing your best, you will feel good about yourself, even if you still make assumptions, still take things personally, and still are not impeccable with your word. So again, it changes it from right or perfection or even good to a place of saying, here's what I'm struggling with, here's what I'm doing well, here's how I showed up. And it wasn't perfect. So I'll pick myself up. I won't lather guilt and shame on top of it. I don't need that anymore to motivate myself to change. Right? I don't need that fear, that anger, that self-judgment to change. I can let go of that idea that that's how a person grows. And that's how a person improves. I can let go of guilt and shame. I can stop believing that that's how people change and that's how people stay motivated. I can start to practice self-love and understand that's how people truly grow and motivated and stay motivated in the process. So if you fail, do not judge. Do not give your judge the satisfaction of turning you into a victim. No, be tough with yourself. Stand up and make the agreement again. Okay, I broke my agreement to be impeccable with my word. I will start all over again. I'm going to keep the 4 agreements just for today. Today I will be impeccable with my word. I will not take anything personally. I will not make any assumptions, and I'm going to do my best. If you break an agreement, begin again tomorrow, and again the next day. It'll be difficult at first, but each day it'll become easier and easier, until someday you will discover that you are ruling your life with these 4 agreements, and you'll be surprised at the way your life has been transformed. I think this is an entirely different way of thinking about and relating and living in the world than most of us do most of the time, right? And a lot of you who are going through this start to show up in the world in this way. And the coolest thing that happens, when you start showing up in the world in this way, the parallel process is you start treating your child differently. You start treating your child not like the big judge with the capital J, but with greater compassion, greater understanding, greater patience. You set clear boundaries, and you still provide, ask for accountability, but you don't layer it. You don't poison it. You don't contaminate it with all those judgments. This chain of training from human to human, from generation to generation, is perfectly normal in human society. This way that agreements are passed on is what he's talking about. You don't need to blame your parents for teaching you to be like them. What else could they teach you but what they know? They did the best they could, and if they abused you, it was due to their own domestication, their own fears, their own beliefs. They had no control over the programming they received, so they couldn't have behaved any differently. And I think that's the same with our children, right? We let go. We own our limitations. We see how we've done this to our children, and we don't run away from it. And when we do that, we make the agreements that our children have internalized a little bit less toxic. They're a little bit more free to explore, to go beyond the agreements that we passed on to them. There is no need to blame your parents or anyone who abused you in your life, including yourself. But it is time to stop the abuse. It is time to free yourself of the tyranny of the judge by changing the foundation of your own agreements. It is time to be free from the role of victim. Remember, the real you, the authentic you, is still a little child who never grew up. Right? That's unfortunately what you bring to the table as a parent. And so you inadvertently pass on some of that wounding to your children, and that's so hard to look at, to be honest about, because we have so much anger and resentment toward our own parents. We don't know that. We don't think of that way. Most of us think that we've forgiven our parents. But we have so many deep wounds because of what has happened to us in our own childhood that we seek so much to not do it again. Because it's so important for us to not do it again, we're unable to look at ourselves without a great deal of shame. But when we see this, when we can acknowledge this, when we become aware of this, we can develop more self-compassion. They talk about the 3 masteries that he talks about, the 3 masteries that help us to accomplish these things. He talks about awareness. This is to be aware of who we really are with all the possibilities, right? That's maybe the easiest of the 3. It's what probably the first stage in good therapy, good therapeutic relationship accomplish. Then there's the transformation. This is how to change, to be freed from the agreements of our childhood and our context. That's really frightening, to walk away, to walk outside of it, to walk beyond the limits of what we thought was okay, to walk into the unknown, right? To challenge our assumptions, to become something different, to get out of or escape our context. And then lastly, to practice this self-love. Love towards others, love towards self. He calls it the mastery of intent. And that is the sustainable, proverbial sun that shines on us and that shines on others around us. The first step is to become aware of the fog that is in your mind. So the next step is to develop awareness by all of the self-limiting, fear-based beliefs that make you unhappy. Going to the core of those agreements is what I call going into the desert. When you go into the desert, you meet your demons face to face. I don't think it's ironic, and it's not, of course, why I included this quote in here from the book, is that's in a way what happens when we go into the literal desert. I wrote an article this month for the Sober World magazine where I talk about the literal forests and the literal deserts that our clients and students and family go into. But there's also a metaphorical desert. And that's when you walk into an Al-Anon meeting. That's when you walk into one of our intensives. That's when you walk into a therapy session or a support group for the first time. Right? Those are the metaphorical deserts. And we face our fears. We face the risk. It's so frightening to show up in those contexts and to take the risk, to take off your metaphorical clothing, your metaphorical armor, at the risk of having people respond to it with disgust, with anxiety. That's why it's so important when you all show up in all of the meetings that we run, that you practice compassion and patience with each other. And that's hard to do sometimes because other people's nakedness, metaphorically speaking, remind you of your own demons, your own wounds, your own shame in the process. Forgiveness is the only way to heal. We can choose to forgive because we feel compassion for ourselves. We can let go of the resentment and declare, that's enough. I will no longer be the big judge that goes against myself. I will no longer beat myself up and abuse myself. I will no longer be the victim. First, we need to forgive our parents, our brothers, our sisters, our friends, and God. And then there's differences we need to make in our life in terms of people we need to let go of. My therapist talks about this as a long series of goodbyes. That's what life is a long series of goodbyes. And to get rid of those things, those ideas, those relationships that suck out our energy, that negativity. The big difference between a warrior and a victim is the victim represses and the warrior refrains. The warrior has control, not control over another human, but control over oneself, one's emotions, and control over one's own self. So the warrior fights to get out of those contexts and the victim stays stuck. This is an idea of mindfulness. He talks about the initiation of the dead, embracing the angel of death. This is what the Toltec way, in the Toltec way, the angel of death teaches us. That's just our own mortality, the inevitability of our death. The angel of death comes to us and says, you see, everything that exists here is mine. It is not yours. Your house, your spouse, your children, your car, your career, your money, everything is mine, and I can take it away when I want to. But for now, you can use it. He talks about if you only had 1 week to live, what would you do? Would you sit and do nothing and feel sorry for yourself? Or would you say, I have 1 week to embrace life. I'm going to stop being and saying and doing what everybody expects me to do. And I'm going to show up in a rich way, in an alive way. And the fact of the matter is, embracing the angel of death, the inevitability of your death, allows you to show up more presently. But many of us run away from it, are afraid of it, and find ways to keep it off our mind. He talks about this new dream, this heaven on earth that we can create. I want you to forgive everything you have learned in your whole life. This is the beginning of the new understanding, a new dream. Imagine that you have permission to be happy and to really enjoy your life. Imagine living your life without fear of expressing your dreams. Imagine living your life without the fear of being judged by others. Imagine living your life without judging others. Imagine living without the fear of loving and not being loved. Imagine living your life without being afraid to take a risk and to explore life. Imagine that you love yourself just the way you are. When you begin to consider these things, you can be free. And lastly, and in conclusion, this way of life is possible and it is in your hands. Moses called it the promised land. Buddha called it nirvana. Jesus called it heaven, and the Toltecs called it a new dream. But there is really no reason to suffer. The only reason you suffer is because you choose to suffer. If you look at your life, you will find many excuses to suffer, but a good reason to suffer you will not find. The same is true for happiness. The only reason you are happy is because you choose to be happy. Happiness is a choice, and so is suffering. Maybe we cannot escape from the destiny, we cannot escape from the destiny of the human, but we have a choice to suffer our destiny or to enjoy our destiny, to suffer or to love and be happy, to live in hell or to live in heaven. My choice, he says, is to live in heaven. What is yours? And so that's powerful stuff. Most of us want to blame our suffering. Most of us are victims to it. Most of us say that somebody else is causing it. And the idea in the Four Agreements is that agreement, that idea is a lie. That idea is something you were taught by your parents, by your context, by your growing up context. You were told by others that you caused their sadness and their pain, their hurt and their fear. And it was a lie. And you inadvertently pass on that same agreement to your children. And it's a lie. Your pain, your fear, your anger is self-chosen. Maybe not consciously as of yet, but it is self-chosen. And you hold on to it. And you can learn to let go of it. Liberate yourself and your family and the next generations from it. All right, that's a lot of pretty metaphorical, spiritual stuff, but I'm happy to take any questions and see if I can answer them. It's a great book, by the way. I know this is kind of the Cliff Notes version of it, but it's as much as anything an invitation to read the book and to read it more than once. How does this apply to those who interact with you in the workplace? It would seem on some level that one would have to take heed of what others, or at least their superiors, say, or they could be undesired consequences. Please help me understand this. It is very radical. I think Miguel would say you change jobs. That's what I think he would say. You're right in the sense that you have to respond to your superiors to stay in that job. And we might do that for a very short period of time. But he would say find a new workplace. Right? And that's really what Evoke is about for me. It's finding a way where we can express these truths with each other and learn and grow together. We talk about at Evoke having organizational health, and so I think it would be a choice to stay in that job or to move careers or to seek your truth outside of that context if you found it to be abusive. And it's worth it. It's worth it. I've made decisions that are financially penalizing, for sure, to be in a place that was spiritually rewarding and enlightened, for sure, in my context. And I, for a long time, held on to some things in my life because I made excuses for how hard it would be and what the consequences would be. How can we help our children who have cognitive issues outside of the norm understand and learn some of these principles? I think the best way is to live them yourself. I think that these don't preclude being passed on to children with cognitive issues outside of the norm. I think even embracing your children with their limitations is a part of it. You know, I have 4 different children with 4 different bases of strength and 4 very different bases of weaknesses. And each of them stretch me in a different direction. Right? It's challenging. And some of them have cognitive limitations that are significant. Right? These could be things like autism or attachment disorder. So learning to respond to them with love, with patience, with compassion, with understanding, with insight. It can be challenging and stretch you, but it is possible. It's a challenge for me with my own children. It's a challenge for me with the clients that I have that are your children. It's a challenge for me with everybody in my life. But it's possible. It's possible to find myself in a place where it's not judgmental, where it's compassionate, where it's understanding, where I can preserve self-love and self-compassion in that relationship. I don't betray myself. It's not easy, but it's possible. And all I can say is this. My capacity in the past 20 years in wilderness therapy has increased. It was less 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago than it is now. To do this, to be this way with people. So I know it can change. I hope the next 20 years I experience as much growth. I'm typically very uncomfortable with compliments, even if I agree with the content expressed. Somehow I feel there is an ulterior motive. Am I just sensing perhaps what you mentioned as people's compliments are actually complimenting a part of themselves? I'm not sure, but I think it might be several things. I'm trying to tune into my own discomfort with compliments. It might be this idea of judgment, right? Because in a way I'm being judged. It might be, I think there's a pressure about it, right? Like I need to, what if I fail? What if I don't do as well next time? So there's a judgment kind of / pressure with it, right? For me, it's also maybe an awareness of how much I crave that, right? I might feel ashamed to take it in, to absorb it, because I want to be self-effacing. I don't want to be arrogant. It might be all of those things. What I try to do is to thank the other person for their sincerity and kindness. And at times I will say, the same thing is in you, right? But sometimes I'll just thank them for it. Sometimes I don't need to make a point. I can think of an instance recently where somebody complimented me and I looked down and had that feeling of shame. And I remember thinking, and I thought, no, I'm going to look up and just thank them for it. 95% of our beliefs are lies. Does that mean everything that we're taught by anybody is literally false? That's what Don Miguel Ruiz is suggesting, so I can just blame him for that idea. You can just start at the beginning again. Just erase 95% of what you believe, start at the beginning, and try to build something new and something different, and find out what you find. So I'd invite you to go ahead and read it on your own and see what you think about it. Here's our intensives and workshops coming up. The workshops, we want all parents that are current parents to attend them. Contact Gail at evoketherapy.com for more info into RSVP. The Heroic Journeys in Finding You are for families or individual adults. The Finding You one in June is filling up. The May one is already full. You can contact intensives at evoketherapy.com. The workshops are multifamily, education, and experiential. The Heroic Journeys in Finding You are small groups of really intensive work to look at some of the things we talked about tonight. The parent support groups coming up are listed here. I won't read them all out loud. I will say that I'll be in Philadelphia in 2 days. So I'll see you in the Philadelphia area then. Our pursuits are adventure trips for young adults and for families, sober, fun, high adventure experiences. Excuse me. Here's a list of some support groups that we ask all parents to go to 6 of while their children are with us. Follow us on social media and make sure you check out our blog. Go to our Parent Alumni Foundation book page. There's the copy of the book. And then tomorrow night I'm going to be talking about the book You Are Here by Thich Nhat Hanh. So that'll be tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. Look forward to that. One of my favorite books on mindfulness and presence. And it's a meditative look at the self and our journey. So I look forward to talking about and giving you a review of that one tomorrow night. So I hope this is helpful. Thank you for your participation, for your questions, for your investment, and I hope this is helpful, and I'll see you tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. Take care. Bye-bye.